All right, I see the numbers are climbing here. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Fund Finance Association's Diversity in Fund Finance Boundary Breakers Fireside Chat with our special guest, Keith Wetmore. My name is Anastasia Kaup. I'm the co-chair of Diversity in Fund Finance for the U.S. region. I also am a managing director and partner at Fund Finance Partners, which is an independent advisory firm advising fund sponsors, asset managers, and their portfolio companies on all manner of debt financing solutions to achieve various objectives. Previous to this, I led the fund finance practice at a major global law firm. Just a couple housekeeping items, and then I'll introduce our guest of honor. Please note that this program is being recorded for others to be able to view it in the future. And you're welcome to ask any questions or raise any points for discussion in the chat. We'll also share some information in the chat on how you can learn more about the Fund Finance Association and Diversity in Fund Finance, which is the FFA's initiative focused on education, opportunity, action, and affinity with respect to diversifying and making more inclusive the fund finance industry. So without further ado, let me introduce our special guest. Keith Wetmore is a managing director at Major Lindsey in Africa, the leading global search firm. He represents partners and groups in placements into top law firms across the country. He uses his deep knowledge of the legal market and his law firm management experience to guide partners and firms in making the right moves. Keith's experience includes serving as chair and chief executive partner of Morrison & Foerster LLP from 2000 to 2012, serving 4 3-year terms, the longest tenure of any chair in the modern era. He took the lead in setting policy, providing strategic direction to the 1,000-lawyer global law firm. During his tenure, the firm more than doubled its revenue to over $1 billion and tripled its net income without increasing attorney headcount. And relevant to today's discussion, he's often described as the first openly gay leader of a major law firm. He has been active in issues relating to LGBTQ attorneys in the workplace and HIV and AIDS advocacy for his entire legal career. Keith also serves as an outside director to the board of North Highland, a mid-sized consulting firm where he chairs the compensation and talent committees. And he also serves on the board of the San Francisco SPCA, which he chaired from 2018 to 2021. Keith is normally based in and around San Francisco, but joins us today from New York. Keith, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for Boundary Breakers. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you. I should add, I'd not made the connection, but before I ran MoFo, I spent 20 years as a debt finance lawyer. So we have a lot, we have more things in common.
Thank you. And that's relevant to today's discussion, which we'll get into for many reasons. But you are a true boundary breaker in the sense that, in many senses, I expect, but particularly your leadership of MoFo for so many years and being described as the first openly gay leader of a major law firm. Before we get there, I would love to start with a little bit about your background, what led you to a legal career, where you grew up, how some of those experiences may have shaped your experience as an openly gay man and your work in the finance industry and also the legal industry.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Northwest Indiana in a smallish town, Valparaiso, where my parents were in the funeral business. And it gave me a real orientation toward the service industry. I mean, I often think when I find people disgruntled with the practice of law, I think it's often because they didn't know what they were getting into. It is a service business. If you don't like being in the service business, you will not like being a lawyer, because I don't need to tell you, Anastasia, your time is not your own.
That's right.
And get rewarded for anticipating needs, not assuming things.
That's a great way to put it in my experience as well, Keith. Would you mind sharing, when did you think that you recognized that you may be a part of the LGBTQ community?
Probably in law school. Well, I don't, we don't need to go on on the couch. I suppose, lots of childhood, adolescent stuff, but really I came out while I was in law school. So that would have been 1977, 78, which for anyone, I think anyone listening to this call realizes the 70s were a very different time on all of these issues. I'm sure you've seen the study, the Gallup results showing basically there's been no social issue in the history of modern polling that has moved as quickly and significantly as the public view of LGBT questions.
And that's in part due to people who broke boundaries and led the way for folks like myself, since I'm also a part of that community, to live openly and authentically. Could you tell us a bit about, for those of us who weren't around or maybe not in the legal or finance industries at the time, what was it like to be an openly gay person in the 70s, and where were you at the time? I'm sure that answer also changed whether you were in Northwest Indiana, which I know very
Yes.
well because my wife is from there, or San Francisco, let's say.
Right. Well, I'd have to say that my coming out played a material role in choice of location. I really did not think about any place other than New York and San Francisco.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I did well in law school, and I had good clerkship, and I had options, and I got to, but I narrowed those options pretty quickly to those markets because I sensed that there would be the lowest degree of discrimination, the lowest degree of friction, I'll call it, around coming out in those markets professionally. And I think that was, in hindsight, it was an accurate perception. Today it's a very different. It's a radically different world in terms of professional choices for folks at the time that really shaped it. I chose to come out to my firm before I started working there in San Francisco, and I'm pretty sure, although there certainly were gay partners in the firm, they were not out to their colleagues.
Mhm.
And there were no associate. I think so. I was kind of the first person, and it was not as I put it at the time, I said, look, in a perfect world, I wouldn't be talking to you about this, but it's not a perfect world. And so I want to make sure before I sign up that you're good with this, because I'm not going to live a closeted life. And the reaction at MoFo was, ultimately I took a job there. It was positive enough. I can't tell you that it was not a mini pride parade. It was sort of a response that, well, at first the question was, well, I'm fine. Are there other people you want me to talk to about this? And I said, well, probably the people I'm going to be working with. I would appreciate your running it past them. And the response there was from some, I'd just as soon not have known, but I'm fine with it. So anyway, and obviously it all turned out okay.
And thank you for sharing that. Is it fair to say that it was sort of a don't ask, don't tell kind of a climate in many professional settings back then?
I think that's probably accurate.
And
In that, again, I thought there were partners who had, I think of one particular beloved leader in the firm who ultimately tragically died of HIV. But he had, in fact, there were two very significant MoFo partners who died of HIV, and in each case, their closest friends at the firm knew they were gay, but they would never have thought of bringing, even though they were both long-term coupled, they never would have thought of bringing their partner to a firm event, for example.
got it. And do you recall, if, just to set the stage, because so many members of the FFA are themselves attorneys or work with attorneys and they're on the business side, do you recall, were there I believe I know the answer, but were there any openly LGBTQ student groups like at law school or at law firms at the time?
It was just, really in the mid 80s, I think, is when lavender law and similar things started coming together at law schools. Um, and it tended to be around, and then, again, I think it was mid to late 80s when uh, it was Richard Gilbert at Oric and I pulled together a informal monthly lunch of gay and lesbian partners at San Francisco firms. I remember being on a phone call with, and then issues around healthcare coverage and domestic partner coverage started. It was issue oriented organizing within firms. This was before the days of affinity groups and that kind of thing. So it was kind of self-organized groups around issues, particularly I remember healthcare. And I remember being on the phone with several associates from Paul Weiss who were interested in, that helping that firm, because it really was in the nature of helping firms get their head around some of these issues. I remember being asked by the chair of MoFo to read the policies manual to make editorial recommendations to make it more LGBT friendly. And again, around domestic partner issues and healthcare issues, these were live topics. And Oric, for example, really led the way on domestic partner coverage because they had at the time, they had basically a self-insured program. And so they could describe their own terms more freely. MoFo had an all HMO environment at the time, so we were restricted by what you could talk Kaiser into, for example. But once we got a firm, lawyers love precedent. So once Oric got on board, then we had something to trot around everywhere else to get domestic partner coverage.
That's so incredible and progressive for the time. I mean, thinking back to my own experience, even in the 2000s, in the last, not this decade, but last, when I was at a law firm in New York City, we were still advocating for, equal coverage and coverage with respect to transition-oriented healthcare for our transgender colleagues. So it seems some battles are it's a matter of degree, and we're still working on them. But that's incredible to hear that was the case back then. And to set the stage sort of more broadly for folks who may not be as familiar with what the LGBTQ community has gone through and the strides that we've made over the past few decades. Back then, is it accurate to say there was no legalized gay marriage, I don't believe anywhere, but not in the United States, and probably no adoption, probably local, if any, domestic partner, civil union sort of functions or rights, and you could be terminated just from a job, just for being gay. You might be evicted from your housing if your landlord found out that you were a member of the community. Is that all accurate?
Yeah, yes, although we have to also distinguish between what was happening, I think, in the professions and what was what was happening in major urban centers in the professions versus now I don't mean to I don't mean to downplay the risk for people who are in that situation, but there was, yes, a legally possible bogeyman out there in terms of what could happen to you, what could legally happen to you. And then, in fact, what I think played out for people in the professions in major urban centers.
Understandably. And I think we see that dichotomy even now with
Sure.
for example, transition related healthcare and rights and so forth. It's a very different world to live in New York City and work in a major law firm or a major financial institution versus small town, rural Utah, for example, where I have family.
Right.
So Could you please tell us a bit about your experience as an associate coming up through the ranks, working at MoFo? What was that culture like for you, particularly since you had taken the brave step of coming out to them in advance, which is something that not everyone has the courage to do. Not everyone feels comfortable in doing for one reason or another, maybe out of the fear of losing their jobs or being evicted, et cetera.
Well, first we did a lot of, I just kind of set out to do more gay and lesbian recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ruth Bornstein was, we both spent, she I think just retired after probably 40 years at MoFo.
Wow.
She was my first hire, if you would. And she and I, we joke, we do a program that we joke, we used to do a program, the two of us talking about the history of gay and lesbian lawyers at MoFo, and we jokingly called it, the oldest living Confederate war widows speak. But it was, not everyone was out on their resume, but people started being out on their resume. I had a lot of conversations with colleagues who were, to be charitable, they perceived that they were in the closet professionally. I'm not sure how accurate that perception was, but they perceived it that way, and you meet people where you find them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of conversations with people about the choice of whether, how to come out, whether to come out professionally. My rule of thumb, generally speaking, was an observation attributed to Rita Mae Brown, which was that your sexuality in the abstract is really kind of boring. But when you lie about people who are important to you, that is a sickness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the core of my advice, is that, if you don't want to talk to people about, about what you do in bed, Godspeed. That's if you want to keep that private, great. If on the other hand, you're making a home with someone and you're lying about that person or the existence of that person, that's going to mess you up. Plus, it's going to mess you up in your head. It's going to mess you up. It's going to mess up that relationship potentially, and people are going to think less of you ultimately if they learn the truth. So anyway, that was kind of the core of the advice I gave people in that circumstance. I guess in the same vein, I can't claim I was nearly as straightforward, as forthcoming, I guess, a word, with clients. That was kind of the third rail, partly because, by and large, it was a client relationship. It was very business oriented, and we generally weren't talking about what we did on the weekend, right? We're talking about negotiating a damn loan covenant.
Right.
So it's like me popping up in the middle of that conversation to wave the pride flag would seem a little out of place.
Sure. And I think that's something that many members of the community now, particularly those who work in law firms or financial institutions, which is the majority of folks who are members of FFA, they wonder, well, should I be out with colleagues but not with clients? Do I tell certain clients with whom I have a great relationship? Will they be more understanding? This is something that those of us in the community continue to struggle with. And it's I don't know if this has also been your experience, Keith, but it's the coming out process is continual. It's very personal and often extraordinarily sensitive and emotional for everyone, very individualistic. But I find that it's something that happens again and again when you meet new people, you work with new people, you build new relationships with different clients. And then someone will say, oh, such and such, how's your husband? Or what does your husband do? Or what does your wife,
Sure.
etc.
Sure.
And that's sort of, you have that moment where you ask yourself, do I tell them? What do I tell them? How much do I tell them? What are the repercussions if I tell them? Have you had any experiences where when you've come out as an openly gay man, you've suffered a loss of a business or relationship or tension with a colleague. And I assume that's improved over time, but would love to hear your perspective on that.
Partly, particularly since I became chair of the firm, and my sexual orientation became a matter of public record, if you will. I'm so damn Googleable as gay that it's no longer. But no, in the day, yes, and I guess I come back to the same rule of thumb, which is it's generally a good rule not to lie. And so, when asked a question that can't be answered honestly, I correct the question, and that would be the advice I give to anybody in that circumstance.
I think that's fantastic advice. It does get very difficult to keep stories straight.
Right. Yeah.
My roommate, my sister, my cousin, whatever
Right.
it is.
It's like lying generally. You got to be have a really, really good memory to pull it off. So I don't recommend it.
I don't recommend it either. So when you were working your way through the ranks of MoFo, many of the members of our organization are younger attorneys on their way up and thinking, what do I need to do to earn a promotion to counselor partner? I think I might want to do that someday. Did your experience change, or was it impacted at all, do you think, by the fact that you were openly gay? And if so, positively or negatively?
I think it was to the credit of Morrison and Forster, which obviously came to the point 10 years later that they asked me to run the place. I think it was a neutral, right? And maybe in fact there were people who knew. Maybe in fact there was a positive in that there were people who. It was the sort of place that I think people perhaps wanted to know me, a little more because I was moving the needle on an issue that they cared about. But ultimately, I, if I say so myself, I made some lending clients very happy year after year, and that is what got me into the partnership.
I'm confident that that's the case. And I didn't mean to suggest anything other than merit, but in my experience, some firms look at it as sort of a plus on top of merit. Some firms you have to overcome the hurdle to sort of go above and beyond. There's this sort of refrain about diverse folks have to work twice as hard, in some cases, to meet the same standard or the same expectations of someone who may not necessarily be diverse in many cases, and are held to a higher standard or a different standard sometimes. So maybe a certain attorney has to bring in X business, but they want you to bring in X plus 20% or something.
I can't speak to other, I cannot speak to other people's lived experience. That was not my experience at MoFo, and I think that continues to be the case. Whether it was, again, I think at some level people got a reputationally, MoFo likes to think of itself as being a progressive place. And so I think there were certainly some partners who thought my success was of a piece with how MoFo viewed itself in the legal profession. And to that extent, it probably gave some uplift.
And I have heard of MoFo's progressive and excellent reputation, on substantive legal service and advice for many, many years. It was one of the firms that I applied to in law school. Didn't end up working out that way, but I'm sure that was in part something that you helped establish and that you're sort of a success story of, and that you carried on when you joined the leadership. Nowadays, in making partnership decisions, diversity is sometimes a factor, sometimes a plus factor, but in my experience, it's almost a better outcome when it's sort of a neutral, as you described it. I would rather be considered and either promoted or not based on merit, and have sort of think of it as an afterthought. Oh, and she happens to be gay, rather
Right.
than we're trying to fill a certain quota or what have you.
Sure. Well, my advice to, frankly, gay professionals of all stripes would be that I guess I have two sides of a coin. One is life is too short and your career is too valuable to spend any of it at a place that doesn't accept you for who you are.
Hear, hear.
The other side of that coin is your sexual orientation should be like the fourth or fifth most interesting thing about your contribution to that organization. I mean, like I find it, look, I was very honored that the American Lawyer named me one of 50 innovators in the last 50 years of big law. But it's a little annoying that it's because I was gay. It wasn't that I tripled the profitability of a firm. It was, so I kind of like to be known for my concrete achievements rather than my persona.
Absolutely.
And that's my and so that's my advice to people. Be at a place that accepts who you are and be damn good at what you do, and take the place where you want to take it. And that doesn't really have much to do with many aspects of your private life.
That is fantastic advice. So let's transition to when you took over the leadership of MoFo. And I do think it's an incredible achievement to have increased the profitability without increasing headcount. That's a way that law firms often shortcut their way
Right.
to profitability is the numbers game, but you did it organically and through leadership. Could you tell us a bit about your leadership philosophy and whether and to what extent diversity was a factor in there? You'd mentioned that even before you took over in the leadership, you had tried to recruit more diverse folks. I would love to hear about your philosophy leading this global law firm of 1,000 attorneys.
In some ways, I was handed a job that I was handed a fertile field for doing what I did, in that I think the firm's leadership had been insufficient. The firm had been appropriately focused on quality, on contributions to the community, on the diversity of our team. We've been properly focused on those things, but I think the firm had been, the term I usually use is the firm had been hobbled by the generosity and the lack of avarice of our most highly compensated partners. There was no one saying, I need to make twice what I'm making. And therefore, leadership of the firm had been off the hook for really turning the dials in the way that you make a professional service organization a lot more profitable. And so I came in and looked at it, and what really bugged me was the sense that a perception that we were less profitable than a number of our competitors because we cared about service to our community, because we cared about the diversity of our team. And that bugged the hell out of me, because
almost like a false dichotomy.
Yes. And it's that I wanted guns and butter. I wanted to demonstrate, in fact, that we could be as profitable as our competitor firms without abandoning the things that made us special. And so that really was, so, I focused on pricing. I focused on utilization. I focused on the things that, and I changed some culture. There were some cultural norms. I mean, we had as a valued premise for many years that we had an open partnership, meaning we promoted as many people to partner as we had qualified people to promote, regardless of whether there was a business case for making more partners in that practice group. And you just can't run, if you're Wachtell and all your young partners do is they don't have to generate revenue because all they do is lock their door hoping no one comes in and gives them another case. That works, but it does not work at most modern law firms. And we had to change that cultural norm. We also had to change the cultural norm that MoFo was a place where over the course of your career, you probably didn't work as hard. And that was very hard to drum out of the recruiting materials, it was cultural norms.
Mhm.
Because in fact, the people who were successful at MoFo worked every bit as hard as people who were successful at other firms.
Or
It's just we tolerated a range of contribution that would not have been tolerated at other firms. And so anyway, we had to do some cultural transformation to get those dials turned properly.
And did you have any particular focuses other than increasing profitability, changing these cultural norms? Did you have specific benchmarks or goals such as we want to have X% of our attorneys represent diverse communities of any kind, or we wanted to grow in certain regions, et cetera?
Well, we had lots of we had a lot of goal setting around diversity in the profession, and we were and had been for long before I came along. We've been early leaders in signing on to various initiatives, particularly at the San Francisco Bar Association, that was a lot more aggressive than any other city bar association in setting goals and timetables. Um, with respect to geography, I was very focused on the New York market because the hallmark of a profitable American law firm is the size of its New York office. It's as important as Silicon Valley is. Even the Silicon Valley firms are all in New York now, so or virtually all. So in fact, I moved to. I'm speaking to you from New York. I still have an apartment here. I moved to New York in midway through my tenure as chair of the firm. Partly, I got tired of my New York partners saying everything's different in New York. You don't know what's like in New York.
Sure.
So, well, damn you, I'll move to New York.
And so you currently split your time, or is it sort of,
My practice in recruiting is mostly Northern California, but I work with the occasional New York candidate as well. I know the market. I know the market pretty well.
you know the market now because you got out there and you got to know it?
Yes, exactly.
That's great. So could you please tell us about once you ascended to and earned the mantle of, the head of the firm, was there a lot of fanfare in the media about the fact that you happened to, in addition to being an incredible attorney and leader, you also happen to be what most people tout as the first openly gay chair of a major American or global 100 law firm?
Yeah, we had a little conversation about so the chief marketing officer and I and a fabulous longtime partner of mine, Billy Schwartz, who had run the at MoFo, we don't have competing elections. I'm sorry, that's my old pronoun usage. I still have old habits die hard. MoFo does not have competing elections. They have a consensus building process around leadership. And what had come out and basically interviewing every partner in the firm about all potential candidates and then putting forward one name. And so the committee that had put me forward had been chaired by Billy. And he was in the room with me and the chief marketing officer, and we were talking about whether we would, how exactly we were going to handle this. We decided best I suppose, in parallel to the way I approached it when I first started at the firm, we thought it best just to inoculate the issue by it wasn't in the press release, but it was sort of a separate acknowledgement of this. And indeed, like AmLaw ran a little piece called their headline, because otherwise, frankly, the new chair of a law firm is not all that newsworthy. It happens all the time. AmLaw ran a little piece titled, I remember the headline was Up and Out. But interestingly, I think tellingly, I should say, when the chief marketing officer suggested we should, exploit this a bit, Billy Schwartz looked puzzled for a moment, and then he said, we spent in the selection process, we spent exactly the same amount of time discussing your sexuality as we did your hair color. Yeah. Which really speaks to the nature of that partnership.
And that is something that a lot of partnerships should aspire to, that it really is the fourth or fifth thing on your resume if it's on the list at all. And the first is that you're a great person and fantastic lawyer, and clients look to you for trustworthy, sensible, reasonable, responsive advice and counsel, et cetera. So we have a question from the audience here. On the point with respect to changing the cultural norm at MoFo to increase partner and firm productivity and realization, how were you able to push through culture change? Because partners in general are resistant to change.
You don't, the bitter truth is you consult with all your partners, but you don't need to listen to all of them. You need to listen to the ones who are taking you places. You need to listen to the ones who are keeping you where you are and have higher aspirations. Because that's the part, if you give in to lowest common denominator, you will lose the top 10%. And that top 10%, either emotionally, physically, you'll either lose their commitment to the organization, you'll lose them actually to another firm, or they will dumb down their own contribution. And that's exactly what you don't want. You need to be listening to the aspirational corner of the room. And so the answer is, I actually didn't have to drag along. The top 10% was already there. The top 10% was already saying, why are we tolerating underperformance with this degree of, to this degree? They already had higher aspirations. And so what I did was drive the place toward the goals of my highest performers.
That is a perspective I have not heard before, but it makes so much sense when you think about it, particularly because and as you know, now in your current role, helping place partners, groups of attorneys in roles in top law firms, it's no longer the case that people are at the same law firm for their entire career necessarily, and law firms are trying to win the talent war. And how do you do that? You listen to the partners and listen to what the top performers are saying, because you definitely want to keep those folks. If you'll never make everyone happy, right?
Right. That's not the goal. In fact, it's kind of the goal to make some percentage unhappy. It's kind of lead, follow, get out of the way. Or in my case, since I was leading, so it's follow or get out of the way. And you're going to lose, for example, on pricing. It was there were a number of pricing and leverage. For example, we parted ways with a whole lot of our labor and employment practice. Most of us not alone on that. If you look around, other than class actions, most big national law firms, unless they've specialized in it, don't have very big labor and employment practices today. Right. Similarly, we had a lovely going away party for our trust and estates practice. They're my lawyers, for God's sake. I still use them. They're at Chartsis. They're making more money than they would have at MoFo, and they're making partners, which I couldn't do for them because it just didn't fit the business model. So you have to make strategic choices, and that involves parting ways with partners as well as hiring. And frankly, in a professional services organization, you are always looking at some percentage of your senior, your senior team, your partners in a law firm, and you're counseling out some. You don't have an effective evaluation program if you are not, in fact, counseling out some people all the time.
Right. And law firms expect a certain level of performance all the time. There are no guaranteed, there's no concept like academic tenure in law firm.
Right.
From what I've seen. Another question.
In some ways, that's the flip side to, there's no tenure, and there's also no lifetime commitment on the part of the partners. You're having to always create an organization that attracts and retains your best people.
People who perform, yes. Another question from the audience: how did you go about achieving these changes? Was it through the compensation process, or some equity partners demoted to income partners if there were 2 tiers at the time? Or I don't know the entire history of the MoFo partnership, but how do you actually go about affecting changes on this sort of scale with issues as important as firm strategy, global scope and geography, diversity, et cetera?
You do need to have, MOFO is not a place where the chair of the firm unilaterally decides how much you make next year. And I didn't have the power to, unilaterally show people the door. Mind you, it would be best if you didn't. It's best if I'm on your side, but still, I had a compensation committee that was a good model for MOFO because it meant there was a bit of a constructive separation between compensation and the whims of your department leadership, for example. But that said, I had the compensation committee completely on side because you didn't get on the compensation committee unless you were one of those people who had high aspirations for the place and was a strong contributor. And so, I definitely had the compensation committee on side. But it did involve, like, literally with this, you don't have to work as hard, canard. That involved literally rewriting recruiting materials.
Wow.
It involved rewriting, working with the people who were going on campus to make sure our messaging was clear, and scripting more of those conversations, because it doesn't do any good if if it doesn't do any good to announce on high that we have higher standards if the people you're sending out on campus are sending the wrong message. And we really did have to. That was something that took us several years because that was our campus reputation. MOFO was the place where you could get paid market and work a little less. Or I remember in one case, we had a young lawyer who declined to take on the first billing matter that was offered to her because she said, I really just came here to do pro bono. Now, MOFO is very proud of its pro bono record, and we have people who spend thousands of hours of their career on pro bono matters, but you really do have to do the billing work too.
Yeah, it doesn't work financially if everyone.
Yeah, right.
Another question from the audience or comment. Thanks, Keith, for sharing your story. It would be great to hear your perspective or advice for those who are trying to advocate for a more inclusive workplace, but maybe facing pushback from old school mindset. Any thoughts there on some actionable approaches that people can take when they may not happen to be the chairperson of their
firm? Right. Yes. I'll tell an anecdote and come back to the question. The anecdote is I found very interesting. I hung around MOFO for a couple of years after I was chair, doing various projects, and I would have young gay lawyers come to me and say, when you were, is the firm still committed to LGBT issues? And I said, well, nothing's changed. What would make you think the firm was not? And it was just that my presence in leadership was by itself such a demonstration of the firm's commitment to these issues that some things that most firms undertook to signal that weren't necessary. I'm sorry, that was an elaborate way of making the point. And I guess the point of sharing that observation is it really is a powerful demonstration of how important having role models for all diverse populations, what that signifies, more than any policy, more than any statement from leadership. Having someone who looks like you or shares your status as being a little bit different. There's nothing quite like that. Now, that said, you can't wave a magic wand and suddenly have a Black partner as second in command firm-wide. You can't wave a magic wand and have a lesbian running your department. So you deal with the hand you were dealt. So to the question, if you don't have that magic wand, allyship is talked about a lot these days, but I think finding, I think I never wanted for, particularly in LGBT issues, basically there was somebody whose brother or child was gay all the time coming forward and wanting to help. And viewing it as part of their expression, really, of their love for their, someone in their family. And so I would seek, if you're trying to drag an organization kicking and screaming, I would look for, I would try to find the most senior ally I can to help you move these issues forward. Because it is, it does get, it gets exhausting. It can be exhausting pushing a rope.
That is great advice, Keith. And for those of you who are aware of the Diversity in Fund Finance newsletter, I think not in the last issue, but in the one prior to that, perhaps all our newsletters are available on the website, or if you reach out through the information in the chat. I had authored an article on how to be an ally to the LGBTQ community, because it's a question that we get a lot from people who care. It's a well-meaning question most of the time, but they're looking for concrete ways to help. So you may be surprised if you yourself are diverse, whether or not you're LGBTQ, that there are people looking to help you, even if they don't look like you. And my personal experience has been many of my strongest mentors, supporters, the best teachers I've had in my life have been straight white men in many cases. There haven't been hardly any folks who, quote, looked like me or were situated similar to me, particularly in large law firms. So you have to look for allies where they're at.
It brings to mind, I mentioned my dear colleague of many years, Ruth Bornstein.
Right.
There was a point in the mid 80s when I turned to Ruth, and we'd been doing a lot of gay and lesbian recruiting. I turned to Ruth in the 80s and said, "So Ruth, how many gay and lesbian lawyers are there now at MoFo?" And she replied, "So many, we don't all have to like each other."
That is
So
a sign.
I think anyone who's been, who's felt as any category of minority knows that expression. I have to say, my straight white friends don't always get the joke. But the point being, what brought it to mind is the odds of finding someone who is the right mentor for you, who also happens to share your differences, is pretty unlikely.
Right. And or share your background, share your
Sure.
personal hobbies, share your life situation.
Of course. Right. Right.
I find that you can learn from everyone if you keep an open mind. There is something you can learn from everyone you interact with in a law firm or a bank or wherever you may be. And it doesn't have to be that they're anything like you in terms of personal characteristics, to make great connections with other people and learn from them.
Indeed.
So fast forwarding now you're placing partners and attorneys in some of these top law firms. It seems to be diversity is sort of the buzzword everywhere now. Would you be able to give us a sense of, in your role, what firms are focused on or organizations are focused on in terms of diversity, how candidates may best position themselves if they're going to make a lateral move, and of course they know who to reach out to if they need someone to them?
One of the great joys, by the way, my preface for all this is one of the great joys of doing what I'm doing is I'm quite liberated to speak my mind. Not that I was ever taciturn, but so it is virtually every law firm I speak with as a client, as somebody looking to hire talent, highlights the importance of diverse hiring. In practice, I don't see quite the degree of flexibility in approach to candidates that I would expect, given the emphasis placed in the generalist description of their goals. Because in fact, I ran one. I understand there are principles, but if you're actually wanting to get someplace ahead of, in terms of diverse hiring, to get someplace ahead of the pack, it will entail taking some risk that is not a norm for, probably not the norm for your institution, frankly. And I don't see that, I don't generally see that degree of norm flexing.
By norm flexing, could I share an anecdote and you can tell me if this
Sure.
maybe is part of what you mean? Since I'm no longer at a law firm now and can also speak freely. So I worked at a law firm and I've worked at a few law firms, so I won't say which one. They were dead set on increasing their diverse representation with respect to Black female attorneys. They had an absolutely abysmal proportion or representation of the total law firm attorney headcount.
Mhm.
I think there were two at the time, just
Mhm.
abysmal in a very large firm. So they reach out to the diverse attorneys at the firm, say, we're really trying to improve our numbers, in particular of Black female attorneys. We know there are talented, brilliant, awesome Black female attorneys out there. If you have any friends you think may want to come work here, let us know.
Mhm.
So I put the leadership of a certain practice group in touch with a former colleague of mine from a prior law firm who was a fantastic attorney and also happened to be a Black woman. And then they did some interviews. There was mutual love on both sides. Everyone agreed she would be a great fit for the culture. But the firm was dead set on, we want all, lateral partners to bring in X dollars in business. And she didn't have that number because she was coming from a firm where the client relationships were long-standing, broad-based. There was no way she was going to peel off, the top private equity sponsor client of a firm known for private equity sponsors
Right.
client. But could she absolutely grow the business from within? Yes. Could she potentially bring in more business? Yes. And so it ultimately they didn't extend her an offer. And I was very surprised by that. Like, is that sort of what you may be referring to?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. Now, I do want to be very cautious to point out that, on the other hand, you're not doing someone a favor to hire them into a situation where they won't be successful.
Sure, of course.
It's not good for your diversity effort. It's not good for that person's career. Most important, it's not good for that person's career. What is more awful than bringing someone in, with the probability it will not succeed? I would, but you give a pretty good example. If, for example, they thought they had enough work and the problem was just the threshold of what we expect from individual partners, you're going to have to, there are a number of goals in law firms that involve trade-offs. Lawyers are very good at that. And if you're serious about your diversity goals, you can find a way to make some trade-offs.
I would agree with that. And absolutely, we should set people up for success, but there also needs to be a recognition of systemic, historical influences, factors, discrimination, or challenges that some candidates have had that others have not. And so,
Well, I would give a less profound explanation. You're dealing with a much smaller pool.
that too.
And so if you want a disproportionate share of a pool, you're going to need to use a different, you may need to use a different ruler on some metrics.
That's a great way of putting it, and the trade-off consideration as well, Keith. We have another question from the audience. Keith, great stuff. Having gone through the transition from being managing partner at MoFo to recruiting at MLA, what advice do you have for lawyers who are thinking about pursuing alternative careers, including recruiting after their career at a law firm or seeking another change?
Yeah, my only regret is I think I hung around for 5 years at MoFo after I was no longer chair, and I should have gone into this faster. It was quite, first I will say I was rigorous about keeping my fingers out. When I was running things, I was running things, and when I wasn't, I really wasn't. I didn't want to gossip. I didn't want to anyway. But I found myself doing some make work projects, and I should have moved myself along sooner, because it's a lot of fun to do something that frankly, I'm good at this. It completely dovetails with what I did. I probably hired 150 lateral partners in my 12 years running MoFo. And so this is something that just came second nature to me. It is a lot of fun. I'll say, for anybody thinking about recruiting, I'll tell you, the lawyer, even though like at MLA, almost all of us in the partner practice group, I think virtually all of us are lawyers, and many of us have been partners at major national firms. But I assure you, we're the fun corner of the partner meeting. We are the emotionally resilient, high sociability. You know, we would have a very different, if you did personality testing on us, we look very different than the average law firm partner. Lots of emojis and exclamation points and replies all in the emails. It's a completely different emotional environment, if you will, than law firm life. And so anyway, although I think in some ways law firm life gets unnecessarily trashed, you know, for me it was a great career, and I saw a lot of people for whom it was a fabulous career, and there's a lot of personal satisfaction, and you know, and the pay's pretty good. So there's a lot to be said for it. But if you want to move on, get on with it.
Great advice, Keith. And you didn't know this, and I'm not sharing this until now, but I actually worked with MLA for a couple of my own moves and had a fantastic experience with the firm with some of your colleagues in other cities.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
If there are any lawyers on the phone, definitely consider reaching out. So we're coming up on the closing of the hour, and the observation that I'm taking away from this is that it seems like you, among many other boundary breakers, no one sets out to be the first of anything, I don't think, right? Like you're not sitting there, you're in law school thinking, I'm going to be the first openly gay leader of a major law firm. It's something that you earn through hard work and being exceptionally qualified. And then you find yourself breaking a boundary or breaking a ceiling, and then there's no roadmap because no one's done it before, right? So wondered if you had any parting words of wisdom or anything you'd like to share as you reflect on this incredible experience.
Well, I will pass along two observations. One is I really look forward to the day, not long from now, I believe, where we'll stop identifying the first of everything by some categorization. I happen to know our new Justice Brown. She was a MoFo. She was an associate at MoFo, and you know, I think she deserves lots of credit. And the fact that she's the first Black woman on the Supreme Court is, again, I think the fourth or fifth most interesting thing about her. But I pass along the words of one of the modern founders of MoFo, Marshall Small, who was chair of the firm for a few years, but he was my general counsel for my entire tenure. He clerked for William O. Douglas on the Supreme Court. He was kind of the emotional intellectual center of the firm for 50 years. And in his retirement speech, he chose to admonish his partners that he described his experience of being the first Jewish lawyer at MoFo. And that, you know, for many of us, that would seem such a nugget from antiquity, right? And again, we look forward to the day when being the first gay lawyer at a firm is a nugget in antiquity. But Marshall described that experience and how he and his wife decided to take a chance on the Goyim at MoFo. And he admonished the partners that a law firm can be a very scary place for someone who's just a little bit different. And so I pass that on for all of us to remember that the institutions we work in can be scary places. And we should do each every day in our way to make it a little less scary.
That is fantastic. With those words, thank you again so much, Keith Wetmore, for joining us for Diversity in Fund Finance Boundary Breakers.
Anastasia, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at a future DFF event. Please reach out or get in touch with me or my co-chair, Natasha Puri, if you would like to get involved and learn more about the group or FFA. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.